Welcome back. When watch geeks hear the name Casio, they either think of a G-Shock or some of the great budget-friendly pieces like the Casio Duro or the Casio Royale. And today's watch is another that sits in that budget-friendly category, except today's watch has a little bit of a twist, or in this case a sweep, as it's the first sweeping second hand I've seen on a Casio. I've had a growing interest in sweeping quartz watches, and this particular one was brought to my attention by a subscriber. Now, I've tried looking into these a little more, and I haven't found a whole lot of information. In fact, I'm really not sure what to even call them. I do know that they use a module 5566, and I believe they are part of the SW300 series, but I've also seen them listed on Amazon as being the Casio Precisionist, which I'm really not sure if that's an official name or just what the seller on Amazon decided to call them because of the bull of a Precisionist. Whatever it's called, it does have a very nice sweeping second hand, at least for a quartz watch, and with a 2-year battery life and a price well under $60, I figured it was worth taking a look at. So right off the bat we have a big problem, at least for most people, and by big I'm referring to the case. Width is actually not too bad at 43mm without the crown, and 47mm width. It's large, especially for the style, but it is manageable. The problem, however, at least for me, is that the lug-to-lug here is 52mm. Although it is worth pointing out that most of the case is rather minimal and it's just this really huge dial. But let's move on and I'll come back to this at the end. Thickness is alright here at just under 11mm, and it also has a lug width of 22mm, and that kind of goes with its larger size. So there are lots of options if you want to change the strap, and you'll probably want to change the strap. Water resistance is just okay at 50 meters, but really at this price you can't really complain about it. And the watch is also fairly lightweight at 71 grams, and that's with its strap. The case as well as the bezel are this really highly polished stainless steel, but I'm not really sure of the grade of stainless. The finishing of the case is actually pretty good, at least for the price. And just giving it a good once-over, I couldn't even find any real sharp angles underneath the case or even in the lugs. And looking at the back, you can see that the case back is unfortunately a snap-on. But again, for the price, really can't complain too much, it's pretty much standard. Now that case back does have a very nice brushed finish with just a bit of a sunburst effect. Back to the front, we have really stubby crown guards at the 3, and they're protecting a crown that just looks a little too small for the case it's in. It is a little hard to get out, but not too much. Now, as you would expect on a watch at this price, the crystal is a flat mineral, so no real surprises there. And really, up to this point, there really hasn't been any surprises with this watch at all. But things get a little more interesting when you start taking a look at the dial and the hands. On this one, the dial has this very beautiful metallic blue coloring. And it's also really reflective, as you can see in some of these shots. It seems to have a tendency to lose some of that brilliance if there's too much direct light. And when there's too much direct light, it also seems to mask a very subtle sunburst effect as well. The overall dial layout is really your basic multifunction, with subdials for day, date, and 24 hours. There are applied indices with these very thin metallic bars, and I think they actually look quite good against that dark blue background. Now, just beyond the bars, you do have 24-hour indicators that are painted on, which is then followed by a detailed chaptering. And honestly, this is one part of the dial that just seems a little odd to me. Usually, if there are 24-hour indicators, I'd expect them on the inside of the indices, not outside of them. And that would make sense if this particular watch had a GMT movement, but it doesn't. So not only is this a little odd, but I think visually it just creates way too much of a gap between the hour indicators and the edge of the dial. So this is really one aspect here that I don't like. Although one thing I really do like on this watch is the orange tips on the hands of the subdials. There's also this very nice metallic border around each subdials, and each one has a nice grooved pattern etched into them, which gives them a nice contrast from the main dial. And one advantage of the larger dial here is that there are plenty of room for those subdials as well as the indices. And when you look at the dial as a whole, I think it has a very nice symmetrical feel to it. In the center, we also have the Casio logo, which really is a must. Yet just below that, we have 50 meters of water resistance, which really isn't a must. Honestly, unless you have at least 100 if not 200 meters of water resistance, there's no real point of putting it on the dial. The case back is really good enough. Now, as for the hands, well, the hands here are interesting. The hour and minute hands are these very wide and flat swords with really big white loom centers. I think both of them are a bit short for this dial, and I think that white area is just a little too large and kind of clashes with the design. They are loom, which generally is a plus, but here it's not really great loom. I already showed a loom comparison back with the Comet chronograph, and I think it actually has a similar quality loom to that watch as well. Yet here, there is much more surface area than the Comet, so the loom here does last a little bit longer. But overall, I don't think the loom here is very good. So there really isn't much point in having it, so I think they'd be better off just reducing it in order to improve the overall look of the watch. While I think the dial is really beautiful to look at, the design as a whole just really doesn't do anything for me. It's kind of a mixed bag with parts I like and parts I really don't. And in many ways, I think it's just really a large and generic design, and one that I think would easily be forgettable if not for the second hand, which is where this watch really starts to get interesting. While sweeping quartz movements aren't rare, they're not really common either, especially in this price range. And if you're really interested in sweeping quartz movements, then Bulova is really the brand to look at, with either the Precisionist line or the Accutron 2s, as they have this just really incredible smooth sweep, and one that I think is actually better than most automatics. But other than Bulova, the only other movement I know of in this price range is the Seiko VH ones, and while you'll occasionally run into a watch with one, they're not that common. But they do share a very similar sweeping action to this one, with about 4 ticks per second, which is close, but not quite as good as a sweep on a low beat movement, like say a Vostok. Now unfortunately the second hand here does not have any loom, but it does have this really nice orange tip, which I think really looks brilliant as it sweeps the dial. However, adding to the unusual nature of this watch is the shape of the second hand, which I can really only describe as a hollowed out canoe. Just like the other hands, it's a bit short, but I actually do like the skeletonized portion of it. And while the shape is a little odd, I kind of like the idea of it. It's just that here it's so wide, I think it becomes a bit of a distraction. Generally, I don't think the second hand should be wider than the minute or hour hand, and here, both of those are already pretty wide. But in many ways, maybe that's really the point that Casio was going for here, as they just really wanted to show off the movement. Now, I did identify a few other Casios that I think have a sweeping second hand, or at the very least the description says it does. They also have a really interesting handset, but at least the second hand is more normal, relatively speaking. And finally we have the strap, which is really kind of what you'd expect for a watch at this price. And I think the strap here actually looks pretty good with the dial, with that dark brown coloring. And it does say it's leather, but it kind of feels a little more like plastic, especially these really thin loops on the end of it. Basically, you're kind of getting what you pay for, and I think it'll do for now, but in the long term I think you'd be better off replacing it. And as for how the watch wears, well, you can kind of see it for yourself. I think if you have larger wrists, then I think it would be okay. But for me and my 7-inch wrist, I think it's a bit big. Not only does it look big, but I think it actually wears big as well. Visually, I think a lot of it has to do with just that really large dial. But physically, I think it wears larger due to its longer lug-to-lug. For my wrist, I really think 48mm is kind of the sweet spot, and anything you go over that just really starts to overhang the wrist. At the time I ordered this, the price was sitting right around $45, and it's gone up just a little bit since then. And at that price, it's really hard to go wrong with what you're getting here. Yet I'm still kind of mixed on it. I like sweeping quartz, and I always like to see more of them. So it's good to know that Casio is developing them and at a really affordable price. And I'm really glad I bought it and got to see it in person. But while I like the idea of it, the design just really doesn't do anything for me. Although the bigger issue is that I think this one is just a bit too big for me as well. And I'm really not sure why Casio decided to start off doing sweeping quartz with a multifunction rather than just a simple three-hander. Now, if you do have a larger wrist and you're just a little bit curious, I think it's worth checking out. For everyone else, I think it's just best to wait and see what comes next. For myself, I have a little bit of a decision to make on whether or not I should sell this on eBay and try to get a little bit of my money back, or try to tinker with it. I'm kind of curious about how big that movement actually is and whether or not I can fit it in a Casio Duro, which is really what I wish Casio would have made in the first place. Anyway, let me know in a comment what you think about this Casio Precisionist, or what you think I should do with it. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.